and I'm really excited to be having this conversation with you today. So maybe I'll start with giving you a little bit of background of our flagship initiative, Reflections on Our Countries, where it came from, and then we can take it with our speakers one step at a time. So RESURJ is a Global South-led alliance, as mentioned earlier, that was set in 2010 with a mandate looking forward to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals framework, in order for a group, in order for this group of feminists to actually influence the framing of this new agenda, the Agenda 2030 and its indicators, and bring some of the missed and overlooked realities that we're living as women and gender diverse people across the global South. And towards 2015, there was this conversation as RESURJ has reached its timeline mandate. Sorry, some movements on the screen. And in 2015, the Alliance sat together to discuss RESURJ beyond the 2015 agenda. And there was an interest to, after the Sustainable Development Goals framework was already established, to see how can we continue to influence the way people are being addressed as numbers in intergovernmental spaces, in advocacy, international advocacy platforms, and in policy making settings too. That's on international, regional, and national levels. And from that collective decision came the idea of Reflections on Our Countries, where we could use this space, not just as members of the Alliance, but also along with our allies, accomplices, and friends, to contribute to this evidence building around what is being missed in those numerical indicators that don't see us as, people live in very complex lives, multi-layered lives, and we cannot just, get each of the causes we're rallying behind succeeding and fulfilled independently, because that never works. So that the Reflections on Our Countries has been a platform for RESURJ to actually highlight and frame the interlinkages between sexual and reproductive justice, economic justice, and environmental justice. And since then, we've been, I think, on and off issuing from 3 to 5 sometimes editions annually. Recently, we've decided to just limit it to 3 editions per year. And they were never themed except for abortion thematic editions. Then we decided this year to actually experiment with things that made us so angry. And I think because also the Secretariat of RESURJ at the moment has 2 of its members coming from countries that are heavily impacted by the International Monetary Fund deals, namely Sri Lanka and Egypt. So we've made a decision to try and invite our allies and accomplices to come together and see how we can really just write reflections beyond all the economic expert lingo that leaves us puzzled most of the time, leaves us feel like we don't have a say in how we're being impacted, so long as we don't know all the lingo that needs to be thrown left and right. And the premise was for us to reflect on how is that really affecting our bodies in the sense of, how our food, nutrition, and how our mental health too. We don't have a language to basically describe how we're so angry with some of the currency devaluations. And I think, in my personal opinion, I think we've arrived at this, with this edition, by bringing different voices, experiences, and reflections from across the global South. So we've had some of the entries looking at more macro landscapes, looking at, the International Monetary Fund, along with international financial institutions, the IFIs, being those establishments that are keeping the world order the way they are. We've also had entry reflecting on the discrepancies and the hierarchy within the South, like South. So like looking at Sri Lankan laborers and workers in Qatar, for example, and the working conditions in the lead up to the World Cup. We've also had reflections from reflection entry from Sarah Kadura in Lebanon, and I don't mean to not name all the others, but this one has just come easily to my mind, reflecting on her mother, very personally on her mother's experience as a Palestinian refugee in Lebanon, and being impacted by the economic crisis that has just hit Lebanon over the last few years. And we've had from Egypt quite a few entries. One of them looking at the prisoners. Another will be reflecting on prisoners and their families and how they're being impacted by the recent IMF deal, along with another entry from a mother reflecting on nutrition and food security in Egypt as an that is being entailed in the IMF recent deal. So without taking much more time telling you about what is in the reflection edition, I think we'll be also pasting a link to directly to the edition so that you can acquaint yourself with the different writings and thoughts there. I'm really pleased to introduce our speakers for today, and I'll be moderating the session. We have Tooba, who's a feminist researcher, writer, and organizer associated with the Left Wing in Pakistan. She's worked in with various rights movements for the past decade at national level. And we also have Nyanthini, who's a feminist activist and researcher from Sri Lanka that has worked in war-affected regions of the country, and her interests are the economy, women's labor, and education. And finally, we have Nada, who's an independent feminist researcher based in Cairo, Egypt. And I believe my colleague Alia will also be sharing with you the bios, like the fuller bios of the speakers, so that you can get more familiar with their interests and work. And how we're going to go about this is that I will be asking each speaker to give us a brief about their piece, and I'll be also posing one question to them. And we'll do that like two per each, like back to back. So if you have any questions coming up in the meantime, feel free to drop them in the chat box. We'll make notes of them and we'll be posting them at the end of their interventions so that they can answer your queries. All right, so let's start with Nyanthini. Could you give us a brief about your piece? And I will type it in the chat. There is another question that I have for you around what have changed over the years in regards to all the age-old conclusions that feminists have made around IMF gendered negative outcomes. You have about 8 minutes.
All right. Well, thank you for organizing this event, and to everyone at RESURJ who's been working hard to put together the reflections as well as organize this event. Also, thanks to the interpreters. So in terms of the reflection that I contributed to this series, I raised two main points, which I want to kind of highlight today. First is that, whenever we speak of economic policies or even economic events like a major economic crisis, they are often discussed in gender neutral terms, right? Whereas we often observe that, economic crisis and, macroeconomic policies have gendered impacts. And I think it's important to highlight that and discuss it. And in my piece, I particularly touch on women's labor, as well as the different ways in which women contribute, including paid and unpaid labor, and the impact an economic crisis has on women. The second point I wanted to highlight is that what is often again referred to as economic recovery programs, including debt restructuring when a country faces a crisis, with the assistance of the IMF, World Bank, and other international financial institutions. It often ends up as being portrayed as something that, that'll help the country come out of the crisis, will help the people and so on. Whereas again, in our experience, we find that economic recovery programs are often an assault on women's autonomy and women's labor. So these are the kind of two major things I highlight in my piece, and I'd like to say a little more about it later on. But first, I thought it's also important to kind of contextualize what the economic crisis in Sri Lanka is and looks like, and what has led to this crisis before I kind of get into talking about the kind of gendered impacts. So as far as Sri Lanka is concerned, we are facing the worst economic collapse since Sri Lanka gained independence in the late 1940s. It is probably comparable to what happened during the Great Depression, the economic crisis that evolved in the 1930s. Sri Lanka's economy has contracted for the last 3 or 4 quarters. And the impact in terms of poverty, poverty has doubled. We are seeing severe kind of malnutrition among children since the economic crisis hit us. And about 1/3 of Sri Lanka's population have become food insecure. So the crisis has hit us at multiple levels, right? So the key reason for the economic crisis is that last year in 2022, Sri Lanka ran out of foreign exchange reserves to pay back for the foreign loans it had borrowed in dollar terms, right? So it didn't have enough money to pay back the foreign loans. And Sri Lanka ran out of foreign reserves to pay for essential imports like food, fuel, medicine, and so on. Now, Sri Lanka has its own particularities in the way the economic crisis evolved, but we know that many countries in the global south, post-COVID, have gone into a debt crisis. In fact, according to IMF calculations, about 70 to 80 countries have either defaulted on the foreign debt payments or on the verge of default, right? So this is again a crisis that's being witnessed by a lot of countries in the global south, and that's why I'm glad that we are able to have this conversation as well as those of us who work or reside in the global south and are facing these effects. Now, there's a debate about why this crisis happened. And there are many different views. And again, the analysis that we come up with about, the reasons for the crisis often then spill over to the kind of interventions and then the politics that comes out of these situations, right? So the dominant kind of reasons that I have heard in Sri Lanka, and of course, even when countries in the global south go through economic crisis, is that, it's corruption. The countries are so corrupt, the governments are so corrupt, and that's why we are in an economic crisis. Now, I believe that's a very lazy and an easy way of explaining an economic crisis. And I don't think it really gets to the heart of the issue, the structural causes for which the economic crisis occurs. In Sri Lanka's case, I'd like to call it the IMF crisis or the IMF-induced crisis. And the reason I say this is because since the 1970s, Sri Lanka's economic trajectory, like the larger direction of economic policies that Sri Lanka has adopted, has been in line with what the IMF has recommended, right? So for example, Sri Lanka was the first country in South Asia to liberalize its economy, meaning that, it started moving towards free trade. But what we saw was that Sri Lanka's exports largely continued to remain lower than its imports, right? So we've always had a balance of account issue in Sri Lanka. In the 80s, since the 80s, Sri Lanka has been privatizing its public assets. It has continued to undermine and underfund social welfare in the country. Since the late 2000s, Sri Lanka started borrowing in private capital markets abroad excessively, even though the interest rates were higher and the risks were huge. And all of these policies were in line with what the IMF endorsed, right? And a major part of the borrowings was spent in large-scale infrastructure development, in urbanization projects, and in real estate projects. It was not invested in people's livelihoods or strengthening local food production, the production systems, or even spending on the rural economy, which is where a large population of Sri Lankans depend, for their livelihoods and their labor, right? And so I'd like to call this an IMF-induced crisis. Sri Lanka has been doing what the IMF has said. In fact, Sri Lanka entered into an IMF agreement after the economic crisis hit us this year. But this is the 17th IMF agreement that Sri Lanka has entered into. Right? Therefore, I think we have to be careful about this kind of lazy explanation of governments in the global south being corrupt, and and that's the reason for us to enter into crisis. However, I think it's important to also acknowledge the kind of alignment of interests of organizations like the IMF and the World Bank, and class interests, right, within Sri Lanka. And I think governments have continued to implement these policies, not just because of the kind of pressure from the global economic governance, but also because of their own kind of class interests in implementing those policies. I know I've run out of time already, so I just want to quickly touch on the two things that I wanted to highlight. Right, one is in terms of how the economic crisis has impacted women, and I think it has impacted in two ways. One, in terms of the incomes that women are able to earn. In fact, Sri Lanka's economy is dependent on women. Women form the largest portion of the labor in the three sectors that earns the highest foreign exchange for Sri Lanka. They also are a major portion of the poor in Sri Lanka, as well as a major portion of the informal economy in Sri Lanka. And so in all these sectors, there was loss of income and loss of benefits and so on. Two, I think what was unique about the economic crisis in Sri Lanka was that the crisis exposed the crisis in the social reproductive sphere, meaning the kind of care work that women had to take on. And the crisis increased the burden of care work for women when there was no fuel, and food prices increased, and life just could not function as it used to. It really exposed the kind of labor that women provide, which is usually unpaid, undervalued, and invisibilized, right? And it is when the crisis actually hit home, in the sense that people could not function as they would usually with their day-to-day activities. There were protests that broke out, and eventually a mass movement emerged last year. A year on, we are seeing that we've seen what an IMF recommended recovery program can look like. Again, women are being affected in multiple ways. When interest rates were raised, women's domestic debt, the cost of domestic debt increased, and women, generally would pawn their jewelry, and then the cost of recovery of that jewelry also increased. We are seeing new labor reforms being brought on. Again, it's being promoted as something that would allow flexible labor, and will promote more women to participate in the economy. Whereas what we are seeing is it will actually allow employers to easily fire workers, right? It's going to weaken the protections that women already enjoy. Finally, I'm going to stop with this, and we can come back to some of these points later. Is that in the last few weeks we've seen the women from the poorest sections of society across the country come out and protest, and that is because the IMF had recommended a cash transfer program, and it was designed by the World Bank. And when it was rolled out, it was such a disaster that people are furious. And again, we are seeing women come out in protest of these IMF programs. So I'm going to stop there. Hopefully that gives you an idea of what I wanted to contribute in my piece. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nyanthini. And I'm pretty sure that your intervention resonates with a lot of us, because we see how all those dynamics and patterns also unfold in our countries. And there seems to be a pattern there, right? Women bailing all of the three countries in this conversation, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and Egypt, and being called all the ridiculous slogans and chants like mothers of the nations or heroes of the country. So we'll get to talk about all the intersecting patterns here. Nada, I wanted you also to share with us a brief about your piece, and I would like to pose a question coming from your piece actually about breaking generational poverty, which I think is always accompanied by stories of self-made people. And I'm not pranking you by this question, but I'd really like to share some reflections on if you think there is still like a hopeful resonance with such statement or slogan that is being thrown at us as set by the IMF deal between Egypt and with Egypt. So if there's any hopeful resonance.
Sure, thank you, Nana, and thank you for everyone who organized this. So my reflection basically revolves around Egypt's latest IMF loan that it received late last year. And this is the fourth loan that Egypt takes on from the IMF since 2016. And I focus on a social protection program called Takaful and Karama. And Takaful and Karama is portrayed as the main program that is meant to offset the negative repercussions of the loan on the most vulnerable. So just for context, if you go onto the IMF's website, you'll see that this is the first answer to the question of how the program will protect the most vulnerable. If you get into any argument with someone who is pro the IMF loan, economic reform program, and argue on how this does not benefit the most vulnerable populations, you hear Takaful and Karama. So a major component of this program is a conditional cash assistance program that is meant to reach the poorest households. And one of the main selling points is that it is almost 90% of its recipients are women. And these households only remain eligible for this assistance if these women can ensure that their children are kept in school. And yes.
I'm sorry for interrupting. It's just Audrey, our interpreter, is asking if you can speak a little slower so that she can translate to French. Yes. I'm very sorry. Continue.
No worries. So I'm going to repeat. I focus on a social protection program called Takaful and Karama. And Takaful and Karama is portrayed as the main program that is meant to offset the negative repercussions of the loan. And a major component of this program is a conditional cash assistance program, which basically targets the poorest households on the condition that they participate in health screenings. So in the reflection, I lay this out a bit, and then in parallel, I'm saying that meanwhile, what's happening is that, and this is happening is that in parallel to this program that is being rolled out, supposedly in the benefit of women, the lowering of the public wage bill, including spending on health and education, which are sectors that are very heavily populated by female workers. Women are basically losing access to paid work. And this is something that is very fundamental of how IMF loans work. And basically, I argue, like many other reflections, like in this series, is that it's having a double effect on women, having less access to paid work, but also being expected to make up for the lack of public facilities by taking on more unpaid work. And the point is, you know, I'm basing Egypt, and it's in no way new, of how we're going around in circles of the IMF applying conditions that the most vulnerable would bear the brunt of, and would widen gender disparities, and then going around and designing programs that would frame these very same people as beneficiaries, you know, as if it's some sort of grant. But what is important about reflecting, why I wanted to reflect about this is that I think there is not enough feminist analysis on these social protection programs that claim to, you know, whose main selling point is that it targets women beneficiaries. And this is why I think it's important to talk about these social protection programs. And this brings me closer to answering your question, Nena, about breaking the cycle of intergenerational poverty and whether being self-made is something that could still resonate. And I'll go back to the Takaful program because this is what it claims to do. The logic behind conditional cash programs is that it provides sort of equal opportunities to the coming generations through ensuring that they are well educated and they are, you know, well nourished and their health is taken care of, so that they can go into the market and build themselves up and have a chance towards of social mobility. And this is a model that has been used before globally, and you know there has been mixed results and on the impact of this. But even, you know, putting all of that aside, in the context of Egypt, first of all, this comes at a time when inflation rates are soaring and when money is very quickly losing value. So this assistance that is meant to increase liquidity, so households can have more space to think of more long-term things, and therefore, you know, have a chance at social mobility, does not really stand here. And more importantly, the context here is that just a few weeks ago, the president, after the state is not upholding its constitutional requirement of allocating certain percentages of the state budget towards health and education, and does not intend to soon because basically you don't have any money. So you have on the one hand, these programs that are forcing these households, forcing women mostly to ensure that their kids are going to school, in order to break the cycle of intergenerational poverty, when the state is on the other hand, very bluntly saying that we're not investing in the sector anymore anyway. And I think this goes for other things as well. So when we're thinking about social mobility, we need to think about infrastructure that is being put in place for that to be possible. And one of the conditions of the 2016 IMF loan that the IMF placed, the conditions that the IMF placed on Egypt is that they wanted to allocate $11 million out of the $14 billion loan, which is already like a tiny amount, to build more nurseries and improve public transport so that women can have more access to paid work. This has not been followed up on. It was just said, you know, empty promises, never again mentioned. And what this means is that, you know, care workers being passed on from it being the responsibility of the state to it being the responsibility of households to women. And it leaves women who are on the bottom of this chain either having to forego paid work or either having to carry a double burden. So that's another, you know, obstacle to social mobility, especially for women. And another word that comes to mind when we're talking about being self-made, and that is is entrepreneurship. This is and when you're talking about more marginalized populations, it's microfinance. And this is again something that the state has been, going on and on and on about of how 60% of the beneficiaries of microfinance loans are women, and this is supposed to, mean something. But and this is supposed to also help with social mobility. But aside from, the evidence of how these programs are being taken advantage of high interest rates and high rates of default, even beyond that, a lot of these loans are very tiny. They're allocated to, mostly handicrafts and bring up livestock, things that women can do while also upkeeping their unpaid responsibilities at home. So the scale of these projects also don't scream to me, social mobility. They if anything, at best, it's mostly about survival. And also to go back to your question, Lena, I think this is really the talk of the hour. Whether it's social protection programs that are on paper supposedly supposed to invest in human capital, but they're really just used to make ends meet at best, or these microfinance programs. I think it's more about survival than it is about upward mobility at this point. And I think it doesn't really help. I think the state of survival is when you see that the state, that the country itself is sort of in a state of survival, when 50% of the budget is going towards paying off loans and paying off interests, and this also screams that we're in a state of survival, it doesn't really scream social mobility. So yeah.
Great segue, Nada. The state of survival, because I think Tooba has explicitly made a point around it not being this crisis, this financial crisis that we're all living in, it not being an issue of national sovereignty, but more so actually a state of survival. And maybe I will come to everyone later with like a reflection around like how the governments and the states are presenting the economic crises like locally as being, this fight for sovereignty, and what kind of nationalist discourses are emerging from such a stance. And Tooba, like similarly, I would really like for you to share with us a brief about your reflection. That I think you are on mute, if you could. And my question to you is really about how your entry speaks of a very aggressive disposition, and how its lasting effects are still like touching people's and impacting people's lives. And again, like not being a case of national or economic sovereignty. So could you also share with us how you see the interconnectedness between climate crises and the International Monetary Fund deals in Pakistan?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate us being able to have this conversation, because I think after listening to the two other speakers and also reading various pieces, I think there are a lot of parallels between all of our countries. When it comes to Pakistan, Pakistan has gone to the IMF more than 13 times since 1950s. So we started way back compared to both Sri Lanka and Egypt. And clearly we haven't gotten anywhere because we're still waiting for more money from the IMF. And so some of the things that we've been suffering from lately have been what happened as a result of the floods and how IMF dealt with it. Pakistan went through the worst climate crisis in 2022. It has been going through it for a while now. We had some of the worst heat waves in the recent years. It also happened this year. But when the flood hit the country, we lost millions of people were displaced, millions of people lost their homes, schools were demolished completely, towns and cities were, they kind of like went away with water. There were cities we cannot see for miles and miles, there was just water. The flood started in July, and our own national media only started reporting it in August, primarily because they were too busy reporting on the money Pakistan was trying to secure from the IMF. So, this is the kind of impact it has on the people, that the miseries of millions of people being displaced was not being reported simply because the media and the country and the government was too focused on securing this loan, which we did not get. Pakistan just completed another unsuccessful IMF program. Now IMF has promised us another 3 billion. We don't know whether we'll get it or not. And this happened despite the country's inflation rates going up to 37%, which is the official figures. Unofficial figures are that it's way above 40% right now. We are dealing with the climate crisis, with an energy crisis, with an employment crisis, with a land crisis, and also the IMF conditionalities and how they've affected the people is that the dollar compared to the exchange rate is right now more than 280 PKR. It is very close to where Sri Lanka is right now. And because of that, what happened is more and more people are trying to leave the country. One example of that is in the Erasmus Mundus scholarship, Pakistan topped globally, but another devastating example is the shipwreck. I mean, in that ship, we can see that there were people from Syria and other war and conflict, affected regions, but the highest number of people in that shipwreck were young Pakistani men. There were more than 300 men who were on that boat, and they were Pakistani, with women and children included. So, I mean, this kind of gives you an idea of how desperate the times are, that people are looking at any means to get out of the country, simply to have some livelihood and a life of dignity for their families. They're willing to die to live. And this is the situation we're living in. And just to, if you take into account how many years of labor of women went into feeding, nourishing those men that have died, we're talking about, hundreds of women whose lifelong labor has lost because of this economic crisis. When Pakistan was going through the climate crisis and still is going through the climate crisis, the IMF was insistent that the subsidies for the poor should be reduced. There should be more privatization. The currency exchange rate was no longer allowed to be controlled, so it had to be flexible. And because of that, we've seen that so many communities which were already displaced, which are still homeless and barely surviving, are now having to deal with 40% inflation in the country. We've seen women and children not going to school anymore because the parents can't afford it. We've seen an increase in child labor in the country. We've also seen that women have migrated to city in order to find work. And all of this has happened, and IMF has none of the IMF conditionalities go against the ruling elite in the country. For example, more than 50% of the budget goes into loan repayment. But what IMF does not talk about is the speculative land economy in Pakistan. Most of the IMF funded IMF money actually goes into funding large infrastructure projects, just like Nyanthini mentioned happened in Sri Lanka, and IMF says nothing about the unequal land distribution in the country. I mean, let's start with that. Let's redistribute land. Right now, the crisis of urbanization in Pakistan is so bad. Pakistan was known to be an agricultural country. We're not exporting our agricultural goods simply because we are expanding. The urbanization is happening at a rapid speed. And also, there's a very big role that the IFIs played in the recent floods in Pakistan. The main causes of floods were actually, yes, there was rain, there was intense rainfall in 2022, but also it happened because how our rivers were not allowed to flow in their natural streams, because World Bank decided to make dams and barrages for us, and they kind of disrupted the natural flow of rivers and constructed large infrastructure buildings in the flow of the rivers. And that is why so much of the water came to the cities. In Sindh, which is basically the worst affected region by the recent floods, there are some regions who haven't had electricity for 7 days now. So, and they still don't have electricity. It's been more than 7 days. They don't have electricity. It's gotten to the point where people have started migrating. Women and children are migrating to other cities because there's no electricity. Pakistan lost more than 57% of its wheat crop production due to the floods. There's, increased food insecurity. There's increased poverty levels right now in the country. Women are taking up jobs which are underpaid, which are often unpaid and only provide, some form of the pay in kind, like maybe food. The employers are only providing food, not paid income. Also, the domestic violence and sexual violence has increased after the climate crisis combined with the economic crisis. And I'm talking about Sindh, that in one of the regions in Sindh, more than 10 women were killed in 24 hours. There has been a rise in enforced disappearance of anyone who's dissenting. So we continue to see how the economic policies, and we've been doing exactly what IMF have been asking us to do. Since 1950s, it's been more than 70 years now. So, I mean, clearly IMF's once non-solution fits all is not working for Pakistan. But and the same excuse is given that it's because the Pakistani government is inept and corrupt. But sadly, that is not all. That is certainly not, just like Nyanthini said, it's a very, very lazy explanation of what's happening to Pakistan, and IMF refuses to take any responsibility. There's also this recent, I was looking at the IMF spokesperson, and they were talking about climate for debt swaps. And in that, even they said that, there are going to be loans and grants, and they're not going to be debt cancellations. And I think what we really need to demand at this point, given what's happening to our countries, given the climate crisis, given what's happening to our bodies and our people, I think there needs to be a movement, a transnational movement, to demand debt cancellation, because there's no other way. Our people are literally dying on the seas. And I would just like to end here because I think I'm out of time.
Thank you so much, Tooba. That was really insightful and informative, and it's quite drastic. So thank you so much for also willing to share with us like a bird's eye view. Now, I think maybe before we get to the Q&A part of this conversation, maybe I'll ask the three of you, our speakers, to share, like, you have about 1 minute, like immediate realizations or thoughts that came to mind when you read each other's pieces, or the whole edition at large. Like, what resonated so badly or was quite shocking? So maybe we can start with, let's start with the same order. Nyanthini.
Thank you again, Nada and Tooba. It's really, really interesting to hear your experiences as well from Egypt and Pakistan. I mean, what strikes me is that the IMF has been around for so long, and we've been through cycles of crisis in various parts of the world, right? Like from Argentina, Zambia, Lebanon, Egypt, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. And it's the same playbook every time. Their recommendations are the same and the impacts are the same. And it has been difficult, I think, for us to push back. And so I think, thinking much more seriously about alternatives, and it came up in some of the questions as well, becomes important. Nada, when you were speaking about the cash transfer program, we are going through exactly the same experience. The government put out a campaign which basically was, targeting the poor and depicting them as people who are liars and people who are lazy and people who are there to just, produce false information to get this puny little cash transfer that they were going to provide. The IMF recommended social protection program is just 0.5 GDP, and we have a massive economic crisis. It's like, throwing a bucket at this huge, kind of forest fire, right? What would it even do? But the way they're attacking the poor, and again, most of the poor in Sri Lanka are women. So the way they're attacking women, and women whose labor kind of keeps this economy going, and life going is appalling. And in terms of Sri Lanka, we don't have enough conversation about climate change, although it's a small island surrounded by water, and it's a very present danger. And so when you were talking to about the climate crisis and in relation to the kind of austerity program and the IMF, that is an area I think we can learn much more from the Pakistan experience and kind of take into heart, I think. I don't know, yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you, Nada. How about you?
So yeah, just hearing you both speak now is, yeah, it's crazy how this is really similar. And one thing I didn't know about is the investment in infrastructure and urbanization that comes along with this, because this is very much what Egypt is going through. So this is a common point that I did not know about. And I think with both reflections, like the common thread that I've seen and that really resonates with also what's happening in Egypt is how women take up more labor in terms of either managing household budgets or in terms of just basically taking on the labor that, I mean, in Tooba's reflection, there was some talk about lack of government infrastructure that was available to spend on rehabilitation after the floods, and how women, had to step up for this. Also, really important point in Nyanthini's piece is on how increased female labor, increased participation in the labor force for women is not, is sometimes plays out in ways that are not necessarily great. So it's really important. That was really important for me to understand that we need to be critical of this as well. Yep.
Please, Tooba. Thank you, Nada.
I think I have very similar observations. I mean, I knew more about Sri Lanka because we are closer. I have a lot of friends there. But hearing about the social protection program in Egypt, I mean, our government is offering 2,000 PKR a month to women, which is absolutely nothing. I mean, it covers absolutely nothing given where the inflation stands. It does not even, it does not even permit you to buy enough flour for the month. And that is a social protection program we have right now running in Pakistan. Also, I feel like in Pakistan, the female labor participation is much lower as compared to way lower than it should be. I think it's at 27% or something. But it also gives me an insight into how women are brought then to take care of the economy when our states fail us. I mean, in Pakistan's context, it's happening through care work. It's happening through women giving out their labor just to get some food for their children, if not for paid wages. And I think that is happening increasingly now. I know so many, because I visited the flood affected regions and we're working on a livelihoods program there. I've seen how, women are struggling because initially the villagers were sustaining each other by buying from each other, and they no longer have that buying capacity. So in terms of that, all the burden does fall on women in that sense. And also, of course, with the floods coming and the climate change and the food insecurity happening, so much of the care work in terms of also taking care of the elders is also falling upon women. Taking care of sick is falling upon the women, and state is utterly failing us. And it's very similar to what both of the other speakers have shared. And I'm very thankful for these conversations and for us to be able to, have this exchange. So thank you.
And thank you, Tooba. And I think you did already in your intervention mention something around what is like how you envision the way forward. And it is one of the questions that are coming to the three of you around the current and envisioned alternatives and solutions. So we don't maybe we start, whoever feels like ready to answer this. Tooba, you already shared yours. If there's like more of an elaboration that you'd like to add to your forward-looking point, please feel free to do so. But I'm wondering also if Nada and Nyanthini have a vision, like it doesn't have to be very elaborate or full of like how it can move forward.
So yeah, I'm just going to say that for Egypt, I think we need to start with being able to monitor the state budget, and this is something that we don't have any access to, have very little access to. So we oftentimes don't even know what's going on. We can't really monitor where funds are being spent. So this is, if I envision the way forward, I think it would start with this, keep the state accountable. Investing in proper infrastructure, as I said in the beginning, in terms of pushing the state to invest in health and education. And again, we didn't even have access to this. We've been saying for so long that the state is not adhering to what it needs to spend, but it's just now that there's been this recognition. So I think just pushing for more spending on structure, whether that's health, education, care. Yeah, that's what I'm thinking for now.
Thanks, Nada. Nyanthini, I'm not sure if you're still with us. I see your camera is freezing, so I'm not sure if it's my internet or not. Okay, so maybe we move to another question and then we'll wait till they rejoin, till she rejoins us. Tooba, there was a question directed to your intervention around, the crisis, the environmental crisis that it just took place in Pakistan, and there is a question around what kind of data do we have around the impact on women and girls with disability amid this crisis, and also how they were protected.
They weren't protected. Sadly, we have no data. There are very few. I think there's one government organization who works around that, and they have very little resources. So sadly, there has been very little data on this, and they were not protected. There were no data shared. There were no programs launched to give support to communities living with disabilities and other vulnerable communities. Also during the floods, I also saw a question about the trans community in Pakistan, and actually they were actively discriminated against. The government itself was not able to reach out to people because it had no resources, and also perhaps a lack of will. In the absence of government infrastructure, the community-based organizations and some religious right-wing organizations stepped up, but the religious right-wing organizations categorically discriminated against religious minorities, as well as transgender and queer communities in the country. They actively worked against them and did not provide any kind of support and help or evacuation to these communities. So people from these communities and some feminist organizations stepped up to provide support for them. But sadly, there was very, very little support that they found from the government. And we still don't have any data. A year on, we still don't know what happened to people. There's very little data available. They're just estimated numbers that we have. But they're not segregated in terms of disability or religious minorities or gender minorities. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Tooba. And I think this is again coming up as a a pattern here, or like a trend of like, not having the access to data or information, or being able to collect it, especially in times where it's not that possible to collect data, because it really takes like a bigger infrastructure than what we can do organizationally or individually, along with your call for action to feminist movements and groups of what we should rally behind. There is another one big question to the three of you that I'd like to pose, and then I have a question that I will pose later. But the question to the three of you is, what is the role of domestic capitalists in continuing to prop up political regimes that are crony to the International Monetary Fund and its destructive agendas? And how do nationalist political movements factor in this particular collusion, if they do? Whoever feels ready and would like to share reflections around that, please unmute yourself from the speakers. And also, maybe after the speakers share their reflections, others in the room also who have some thoughts around that, please come join us.
I can go first if nobody else is okay. So I can give you an example. In Pakistan, like one of the biggest issues that plays a very big role in our economic crisis is the speculative land economy. Pakistan is not focusing on, let's say, producing things that it can export. And Pakistan has a crisis because it has low exports and high imports. And what has happened in the previous few governments is that the government has colluded with the landed elite who are turning large rural lands into, urban lands, has colluded with them to basically continue the speculative land economy, which has resulted in a housing crisis in the country. And there are multiple housing movements right now going on in the country, but they're mostly urban focused. So in the urban scene, you can say that there are a lot of housing rights movements that are going on. There are a lot of movements for environmental protection that are fighting against these big landholders and real estate mafia, so to say. At the same time, we say that, I already mentioned in my initial comment that IMF has nothing to say about that. Women own less than 3% land in Pakistan. And IMF has never spoken about that when it comes to women's so-called empowerment that it seems so deeply invested in. So I think there's what's happening in Pakistan is basically a collision of IMF with the military, civil bureaucracy, and the religious elite, and all of them are together in this. So, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. I think that's literally what's happening in Pakistan. And they're just colluding with the others. While there are social movements, there are political movements, but there's so much political repression in this economic crisis that unlike Sri Lanka, people did not come out against the economic crisis. They were so embroiled in other things that were going on in terms of, the political instability that Pakistan is seeing right now, that people were not given a chance to even think about or come out. And I think the fuel prices are so high that even someone like me, who has spent her entire life protesting on the street, I have to think twice about, going and organizing a protest because we can't afford the fuel cost anymore. That's how high they are. And I think that's what's happening, that all the social movements are also being repressed, but also the economic crisis has a very big role to play in the inability of social movements to organize themselves too.
Thanks, Tooba. Nyanthini, would you like to share some thoughts around this? Do you want me to reread the question for you? I'm not sure at what point.
Yes, please. I got disconnected, so I lost the question.
Absolutely. So what is the role of domestic capitalists in continuing to prop up political regimes that are crony to the IMF and its destructive agendas? And how do nationalist political movements factor into this particular collusion, if they do?
Yeah, I think in terms of Sri Lanka's political context, I think, the protests last year got a lot of attention. And one of the key demands was that the president should resign because the former president, Gotabaya Rajapaksa at that time, was seen as not, adequately responding to the economic crisis that had emerged. And there were also kind of allegations of corruption. He and his family were involved in, and so on. There was also a demand for system change. And I think people had different ideas of what that meant, but there was the feeling that the entire political culture should change. What occurred soon after the president resigned was that the current president is an unelected person. He could not even win a seat in parliament. He got his seat in parliament by through the national list when someone else resigned. His party has just one seat. And so in terms of the democratic situation in the country, it's interesting that the IMF is actually negotiating with an unelected government that has currently no mandate in the country, right? However, when this change occurred, we saw support for this change, mainly from the kind of the middle class and then the political class of the country, because there was fear that the mass movement that had emerged can really change things, right, in economic wise. And I think it was a knee-jerk reaction from the middle classes who were afraid of, losing, the benefits that they hold in terms of private property, in terms of like the economic trajectory. And so there is definitely an interest that's converging with protecting the kind of global capital, and for people who kind of benefit from that locally. Another aspect that we are seeing, for example, I'll give you one concrete example, is that one of the recommendations by the IMF is to privatize some of the state-owned institutions. And recently there was a proposal for the electricity board to be privatized. Although it's a profit-making institution, very often the argument that they give is, these organizations are not profit-making and it's eating into taxpayers' money and so on. What we saw happen then was that 40% of Sri Lanka's electricity production has now been given to Adani, who is a regional and global oligarch. And the project was given in the pretext of introducing renewable energy in Sri Lanka. And so what we find here is really interesting, right? Like the discourse around climate change and so on is in some ways the real dangers in Sri Lanka, to Sri Lanka and its people, are being ignored. But then they're making room for local capitalists who have kind of interests that align with the IMF, as well as regional and global players who are looking to come and invest in Sri Lanka at a time when they know they can just sweep up public assets for a very low price, right? So, we see that emerging. In terms of the question about nationalism, I think that is a real and potent danger that we have to keep in mind. The kind of analysis and critical analysis around the IMF from a political economic point of view and from a class perspective or a feminist perspective is actually kind of weak in Sri Lanka. There are only a few voices who are kind of putting forward that kind of analysis. And in the public domain, you see much more, analysis in support of the IMF agenda from, what can be kind of viewed as also the kind of liberal, groups in Sri Lanka. So the real danger is that there might be an anti-West kind of attack. There might be a xenophobic kind of reaction when economic frustrations boil up again. And this space can easily be captured by, nationalist forces. And in Sri Lanka, we've been through a protracted ethnic conflict. Post 2009, when the ethnic conflict ended, which was fought with the liberation tigers of Tamil, mainly, and the target was the Tamil community. Then it shifted to the Muslim community, and there were attacks on the Muslims. There have been efforts to kind of whip up this kind of nationalist sentiments from the various kind of regressive nationalist forces that we find in Sri Lanka. And so that is something I think we need to be very mindful of, especially when we also put forward critiques of the IMF and the global capitalist agenda, being mindful of like the